you all today to Books Between Bites. My name is Kristen. I'm one of the librarians here at Batavia Public Library, and I'm planning programs for adults. And usually Becky Hogue would be up here welcoming you, but I'm sorry to report she's come down with COVID, so it has fallen to me to introduce you and welcome you today. If you're interested in getting a monthly reminder of Books Between Bites, there is a clipboard in the back where you can write down your email address. And there's also a flyer about our One Book, One Batavia celebration that started just this week. It lists all the great programs we have that tie into the book Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Now let me introduce today's speaker. Josephine Tucci is Batavia Public Library's new director since June 2023. She has over 22 years of experience working in public libraries. She started in Reader's Advisory, where she helped patrons find excellent books to read like the ones she will discuss today. Previously with the Lincolnwood Public Library Director, Josephine is excited to be working with this library's terrific staff, dedicated board members, and the wonderful people of Batavia who make the city such a great community. Let's welcome Josephine Tucci.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and I think that'll be fine. I'm short, so that'll work. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I am, for the first time, going to do like a book talk with slides and the whole 9 yards. So it's very exciting. And the theme, or what I'm going to present today, is one of my favorite genres or subgenres. I'm a huge mystery fan. I have been since I was a kid. I remember reading Sherlock Holmes when I was young. I have the complete works of all of the Sherlock Holmes stories in a really old, beat-up volume that belonged to my grandfather. And I started reading it when I was a kid, so it started very young. And I've always been really mostly interested in British mysteries because they just do it so well, and it's where it all started. So from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I went on to Agatha Christie, and then I also, I don't even remember how it happened, but I got into another author who some call the Grande Dame of British mysteries, P.D. James. Absolutely loved her work, and so I just kept, when you find a genre you like, you just find all sorts of authors that are really great. So, then eventually, after all these British mysteries, reading, I also got hooked on what's called Scandinavian noir or Nordic noir. So I'm going to talk about Nordic noir, both in print and in film, and I'm also going to kind of bring in some of these British mystery authors and series that sort of have some commonality with the Scandinavian noir genre, or they're just really good. So I want to share them with you. Okay, so let's get started. So what is Nordic noir? Well, it's light film noir, and the French word for noir meaning black or darkness. Film noir being a filmmaking style that developed after World War II and is characterized by cynical heroes, stark lighting effects with deep shadows, intricate plots, and morally ambiguous and complex characters. And Nordic noir is kind of an offshoot of that. And it's a term that can be applied to both books and film that gained popularity starting in the 90s. Its roots, though, can be traced all the way back to the 60s when the Martin Beck series started by the writing duo, husband and wife team, and I'm going to slaughter all of these Scandinavian names, so I apologize in advance. Maj Sjowall or Sowall. It's Sjowall, so I'm not exactly sure how that's pronounced. And I think she's either still alive or she might have passed away recently. But and then her husband, Per Walu. So it's fiction that is usually told from the detective's perspective, and it's set in a Scandinavian Nordic country, which includes Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And did I miss one? Denmark, Sweden, yeah. Norway, Sweden. What is this one? This is Finland, okay. So, and the earliest examples of Nordic noir film and print came mostly from Denmark and Sweden. And it paved the way for other Scandinavian countries to adopt this style of storytelling. So, Nordic noir has a murky atmosphere. It's often bleak, with bleak surroundings that sets a tone for the story. The landscape is oftentimes there's snow because we're in Scandinavia, but not always. But it shares that quality with film noir where it's dark and kind of oppressive, and there's a lot of light and dark. You don't see a lot of color in Scandinavian noir on film, and in the books it's also the way that the writing creates the same sense of darkness, and the atmosphere is really important to the book and the story. So Nordic noir explores the cracks and corruptions of society. It is storytelling rooted in gritty realism and broken systems. And so the story forms a framework for social commentary and social criticism of contemporary society. The writing style is very simple, it's very realistic, it can be kind of terse, very precise, but the dialogue helps to move the story forward, and the writing style kind of reflects the setting and the atmosphere of the story, and vice versa. They complement each other. So key to Nordic noir is the main character, often a detective inspector or a detective, or not usually a sergeant, they're almost always an inspector, so they're a little higher up. And they're usually pretty morose and tormented souls with some kind of a complicated past, some trauma. Oftentimes they're haunted by something horrible that happened in their childhood or adulthood. They're almost always single, divorced, or widowed. There's a lot more male detectives in the genre, but that has changed over time, and there are quite a few really dynamic female detectives who are also, haunted and traumatized and all that stuff. But it's the troubled loner detective who's tired and bruised by all the crime they see, and their dedication to their jobs often takes a serious toll on their mental and physical health, as well as their home life. The Scandinavian detective is often, like I said, single, divorced, widowed, with prickly relationships with their offspring, if they have any, and they are world-weary, but they doggedly pursue solving crimes and finding the killers. So I'm going to talk about a few authors from each of these Scandinavian countries, and I'm going to admit I have not read all of them. I have read quite a few, but I certainly haven't read all of them. Some of them are kind of hard to find. So as you can see, I'm going to start with the Finnish authors. We've got Max Seek. I don't know if he has an actual series, but I know he has some standalones, and one of them that's gotten a lot of publicity is The Witch Hunter, which I actually checked out recently, but I haven't started yet. So he's a Finnish writer, and then there's Lena, who wrote the Maria Kallio series, excuse me, and James Thompson, who is writing the Inspector Karuivara series. So you'll see there's like a little asterisk there. When there's one, it means that you can actually find copies of these books, some of them, if not all of the books, here at the library here at Batavia. And if there's two, it means you can get these books through interlibrary loan. So we can request them from another library, have them brought here, and you can check them out if we don't have them. And there are some Finnish series on TV that are based on the Finnish version of Nordic Noir that I have not personally watched because there's just not as many, but they're starting to get a little bit more viewership. And then there's Icelandic authors. A very popular one is Ragnar Johannesson. He is writing, because he's still writing, the Dark Iceland series featuring Detective Ari Thor. We have those copies here at the library. And then another very popular one is Arnaldur Indridason with his Erlander series. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce this last one. There's so many letters that don't seem to go together. So the Thora Good, I'm not going to pronounce that either because I'm going to slaughter it. But I'm not familiar with that series, but this is another popular Icelandic author. And all of these books are available here at Batavia Public Library. One thing to note about Icelandic authors is that they do not go by their last name first. So when you're looking for books on the shelf, if you're just browsing, you have to look for their first name. Because I was looking all over for Mr. Indridason, and I couldn't find him. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's under A. And there he was with all of his books. So that's, and I believe that there is a TV series based on the Erlander series. But I'm not 100% sure on that. The Darkness from the Dark Iceland series, which is by Ragnar Johannesson, is going to be a film or a TV series that's going to be released sometime this year, so that's something to look for. And then Jar City is a popular title from the Erlander series, which was also made into a film back in 2006. It's an English language version, though, set in Louisiana. It was an English, that was back in, the Icelandic version was released in 2006. There is a new version in English set in Louisiana that's in development now, so that will be released soon. We'll see how that turns out. Now, the Swedish authors, they really are the kind of the heart and soul, I think, of Nordic Noir, and that's where I've done a lot of my reading. So one of the earliest, I think, writers that can be credited as kind of starting the whole Nordic Noir are the husband and wife I mentioned earlier, Maj Sejowal and Per Walu. They wrote a series of books. There were 10 in the series called Martin Beck. Excuse me, Martin Beck was the chief inspector, and he had this whole crew, his team, that he worked with. And what makes these novels really different was because it was the first time in Sweden, or pretty much in a lot of places, where they really got delved into the intricacies of the relationships between the detectives, as well as the relationships of all of the suspects, and there was just character development was really rich, and it was spread throughout all the characters in the novel, not just the protagonist. And it was they introduced this whole idea of social commentary. They were critiquing contemporary Swedish society, and when they started writing these books back in 1965, and they really blazed the way for these other writers that followed suit. And the Martin Beck series, I did not see any copies on our shelves, but we can get them through interlibrary loan. I meant to show these to you. I brought some, I tried to pull as many of the first in a series as I could, if anybody's interested in checking any of these out. So here's Max Seek, he's one of the Finnish writers. He wrote The Witch Hunter, and I'm sorry, I have that checked out. So, but I do have this one, it's The Last Grudge. I believe he has all standalones. I don't think he has a series. And then I also brought with me, this is one of the books that we do have on the shelf, and it is a Martin Beck story, but it's right in the middle of the series, and it's called Murder at the Savoy. But if you want to read them in order, which is, I like to do that because of the character development in the story, we can get those for you through Interlibrary Loan. And then here from Iceland is Jar City. This was a very popular, I believe there was a movie made about it, and he's got a whole series, and the detective is based out of Reykjavik, which I think is the biggest city in Iceland, and he's got a troubled past, and it's dark, and there's lots of snow. And then here's another one by the same author called Reykjavik Nights, and this is a prequel. This was written much later in the series, but it acts as a prequel to the very beginning. So he has his two most recent books are actually prequels to the original story, or the original series. Okay, so, and another thing to note is that it's arguably, there are some that say that these Swedish writers, the husband and wife team who wrote the Beck series, and other Swedish writers were really influenced by the writing style of some American authors who were writing in the 50s, like Ed McBain. We have a few Ed McBains, and so these are kind of like gritty police procedurals, and there were a couple of other authors who I can't think of off the top of my head, but Ed McBain had a lot of influence in his writing style on some of these Scandinavian authors. But now on to my favorite author, Henning Mankell. He's a Swedish author who developed the Kurt Wallander series. Is anyone familiar with that series? Yeah. It's hard not to. If you like PBS, you've probably seen the British version on PBS, which is based more closely on the actual novels, which is great. It's kind of, I always find it kind of weird because I started by reading, I read all the books. I haven't read the last one though because I don't want the series to end. So I still have it, my brother gave me a copy years ago and I still haven't read it because I don't want the series to end. The original, okay, so the books, he started writing the books in the 90s. The first one, which was Faceless Killers, this one here, was written in 1991. And he kept writing, I don't know how many books there are in the series, but I want to say maybe 10, maybe a little more. Well, he started writing in 1991 with Kurt Wallander, and then he stopped writing, he stopped writing the series in 2009. I think he was done writing about Wallander, and it was starting to be more commonly available in video form, and I think sometimes that can jade the author because it's somebody else's interpretation of a character, and then it becomes more popular than the written version of the character. So anyway, he started with Faceless Killers. He's also written some standalones that are not part of the series. He's written children's books. He's just very prolific, and I'll talk more about him in a minute. And then another author that was really helped make Scandinavian noir super popular internationally was the Millennium Trilogy, which is, let's see, here we go. The girl with the dragon tattoo, the girl who kicked the hornet's nest, and the girl who did something else. And that's part of that trilogy. And these are very dark. I mean, all of these books have dark themes to them. Horrible things happen to good people. and horrible things happen to bad people. So these are not for the faint of heart. If your preference is a good cozy, you might not want to consider Scandinavian noir. But it's such compelling storytelling, and just the landscape, the characterization, and it really does explore the underbelly of society and just how corrupt people and systems can be. So anyway, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo I have not read these, but I've seen the Swedish movies that are based on all 3 books. It's excellent, but it's graphic and it's disturbing, but it's so well done. Anyway, we have these books here. Unfortunately, I don't know if you know much about the author, but he died before the books were even published. He was like 42 or something. Was it an aneurysm or a heart attack? It was something very sudden. And now they've got these other authors, they're Swedish, like David Lagerkrantz, who wrote 3 more books after, from 2015 to 2019, and I forget what they're called, but they're more about the main character. What is her name?
Elizabeth.
Thank you. And I think those are pretty popular, even though it's a totally different author. And now Karen Smirnoff, a woman, has started writing more novels based on that character. She wrote 1 back in 2022, and I think there'll be more to follow. They keep coming in groups of 3s. And then another popular Swedish author, Lars Kepler, which is a pseudonym for a husband and wife writing team, Alexander and Alexandra Onderhill. And they write the Unalina series, and we have those books here at the library as well. And I can show you, here's Lars, like The Hypnotist. This is one of their, I'm not sure if it's the first, but if we didn't have the first on the shelf, it's either checked out or we just don't have it, so I brought at least something to see if you wanted to look at it afterwards and browse through it. And I think, yeah, okay. So now we're going to go on to the next countries. We've got Denmark. Has anyone ever heard of Peter Hoeg and his book, Smila's Sense of Snow? Although Smila's Sense of Snow is not part of a series, it was one of those early Scandinavian, Danish novels that was very unique in its landscape, in its the characters, and in the verbiage that was used, the style. It had this bleak sensibility, and it was this lone woman who was probably on the spectrum, but was a real loner, trying to solve a crime of a child who died. And it takes you to Greenland. It takes you, you're kind of globe hopping a little bit. And it was 3 years after the book came out, it was made into a movie, and it was starring some famous people I can't think of right now. But it was a standalone. But that was also one of those early books that kind of brought Nordic noir to an international audience. So the Department Q series by Jussi Adler-Olsen, that is a really dark series. It's got some humor in it, I mean, sometimes the banter between the detectives can be humorous, but the crimes themselves can be very dark. So if you are squeamish or you don't want to get really depressed, you might not want to read these. And there is a series, I believe, I don't know how many are in film, but they are based on the books, and they're pretty dark too. Pretty dark, disturbing stuff. But we do have the first book in the series, The Keeper of Lost Causes. And so the character, what's his name? It's Carl Mork, and he's this brilliant but super unhealthy and unkempt detective with a lot of personal problems, and he was involved in some kind of a police raid, and some people died, and he was blamed, so he got pushed out of homicide or whatever department he was in, and he was sent down to work in the missing person, or cold cases, the cold cases department. And so his office became like this storage room in the basement of the police station. And he had to put together his own team of kind of, quirky individuals. And that's how and then that department, his department that he had established for cold cases, was called Department Q. And so he leads this kind of team of misfits to solve crimes that have been really difficult because they were not solved the first time around, so they're revisiting them and trying to solve them. So this is the first one, The Keeper of Lost Causes, which I think is who he was. Starting this team, he was trying to solve lost cause cases. And let's see, so Sarah Bladel is also a very prolific and popular writer who wrote a series featuring a female detective named Louise Rick. And the first book in the series is, she's out of Copenhagen, and the first book of the series is called The Midnight Witness. It's this one right here. And the mystery involves two murders that she is, the main character, Louise Rick, the detective, is tackling and trying to see if they're interconnected. And one of her, and her best friend, who's also a main character in the story, Camilla Lind, is involved in one, I think, of the murders. So there's the complexity of their close relationship and the crime itself, and two murders overlapping, set in Copenhagen. It probably was snowing. So it's, you can get to imagine what the tone of that story is, but she's very popular, and I think that these women detectives are getting more and more common, more and more popular. They are just as damaged as some of the male detectives, but they're always interesting, very deep characters who you just wonder how they get out of bed in the morning. Let's see. So also, this author, Sarah Bladel, she is known to be really meticulous in her research, and she has a great attention to detail, especially when she's writing about autopsies and forensic science and anything related to police investigations. So she's very detailed. And now when we go on to Norway, there's a really popular series, and it's not Hole, it's Harry Hule. Which I'm always going to slaughter. But that's a really popular series out of Norway, and he is like the quintessential Nordic noir protagonist. He's an introvert, he's prone to depression with a traumatic childhood experiences. He is early on he's an alcoholic, later on in the series he's a recovering alcoholic, but he has a very cynical view of the world. But he's a brilliant detective, and he sometimes uses questionable means to solve a crime and get the killer. So the first book in the series, The Bat, right here, Harry Hule is sent to Australia to solve the mystery of a young Norwegian woman who was living in Australia and was murdered. So it doesn't even take place in Norway, it takes place in Australia, but it's the very beginning of meeting Harry Hole. And the thing about Harry Hole is he's his own worst enemy. But as you read the series, like with a lot of these series from other authors, you really get to know the characters so well. You get to know their backstory. It's slowly revealed to you from one book to the another. And I love a series because of that, because when you read a book and it's a standalone, it's great. You enjoy it, but sometimes you're wanting more. You're like, what could happen next with this character? And so it works so well with mysteries in that each novel kind of builds on the one before it in terms of the characters, not the story, but the characters. And I don't want to say bond, because that's kind of weird, but the connection that you feel with these characters is so much stronger, I think, when they're part of a series. And I think that's part of the reason why I enjoy them so much. So another Norwegian author is Karen Fossum, and she's writing the Inspector Conrad Sayer series, which are, I believe, they're set in Oslo. She was originally a poet in the 70s, I think, and turned to writing crime fiction in the 90s. And the first book in her Inspector Conrad Sayer series is based in Oslo, and it is called Eva's Eye. Her writing is a little bit more like a psychological thriller and not so much a police procedural. But again, really great character development. And these are all page turners. These are books that you want to keep going because you just want to find out more. And oftentimes there's lots of twists in the plot. You know, you think you're going one way and then you're going that way and then you're going here, and it's just can take you all over the place. So again, her main detective is a woman, I believe. And, oops, sorry, I'm so inept with the mouse pad. It's just always been a challenge for me. And her detective, no, I'm sorry, Conrad is a male, but he's also very faulty. And then there's the Varg Veum series and the Hanna Helmeson series by Ann Holt and Gunnar Staalesen, and I have not read either of these authors. I couldn't find them here, but they are available through other libraries, so you can still get them through interlibrary loan. The hardest ones to find were, I think, the Finnish writers in print, but that has changed so much over the last 10, 20 years with, you know, the popularity of this genre. It's much, much easier to get these international authors. But part of the trick is they have to have their work translated before we can even get to it. And sometimes they won't translate a book in the series until like the third or fourth book in. So you're starting here already well into the series, and you may or may not get a copy of the earlier works in English. It just depends. And if it's an author that has written a while ago, like back in the 80s or 90s, that's even harder if they're not already available. Sorry. I don't know how I got out of my slideshow presentation. Here we go. So, the couple that wrote the the Martin Beck series, Maj Joal and Per Walu, started in '65. They always set out to write 10 stories in this series that they called The Story of a Crime, but is now more popularly known as the Martin Beck series. So from the beginning, they envisioned this 10-novel police procedural series set in Stockholm, featuring Martin Beck as the main protagonist, and they developed and researched each book in the series together, and then they would take turns writing alternate chapters. So he'd write chapter 1, she'd write chapter 2, he'd write chapter 3, and that's how they did all the books. And their series is really the earliest recognized series of Nordic noir. It was the first crime series to mix traditional crime fiction with social issues and a critique of contemporary society. There have been numerous films and TV series made based on this series. A very popular one was, I don't know if you all remember before, so we have Channel 11, right? WTTW, and then several years ago we used to have Channel 36. And I loved Channel 36 because they would play these kind of, at the time, obscure series. A lot of them were foreign language, and that's how I found Martin Beck, was through Channel 36 here in Chicago. They would play these old reruns of the Martin Beck series. So I found the series via the TV film version before I even discovered the actual books. And sadly, 36, and they used to have these marathons, like fundraisers, where they would just do mysteries for like 24 hours. And I was just in nirvana. Anyway, they've done, that's their most popular version, I think, of the Beck series. And I think you can still get it on video, or you probably can stream it. So interesting to note, though, is if you've never seen it, the main character, the protagonist, Martin Beck, his name is Peter Haber, and he plays the villain in the movies, the Swedish versions of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So here he is in Martin Beck. He's like this kind of, depressed middle-aged guy solving murders, but in The Girl Who Kicked the Dragon's Nest, the Hornet's Nest, he's like this really evil, despicable person. So it was fun to see him playing those two different roles. Also, the TV series that I was talking about introduces a whole bunch of new characters you don't find in the books, which is common. But it is based on some of the books, but mostly it's based on just the Martin Beck character, and then they've done a lot of written for TV scripts and storylines. Let's see. So that's Martin Beck. And now we go to my favorite, Henning Mankell. So he was a really interesting person. He has written a lot of books, as I said before, but he also ran a theater group in Africa, and I don't know which country he was in, but he lived in Africa. He kind of went back and forth between Sweden and Africa doing this live theater. And then he was also simultaneously writing books like the Henning Mankell series. And there have been several versions on film of the Wallander series, Kurt Wallander. There were movies, made-for-TV movies made, and then there was, this series where every year there would be a new set of books, or of stories. And that one was the one I watched, and it starred Krister Henriksen. And that was my favorite version. But it was not based on the books at all. It was all based on just the characters, and the stories were written just specifically for TV. But it was a very good series, and that was also on channel, no, it was not on channel 36. The only way I could find that, I think I streamed it, and I don't even remember who I streamed it with, but it was years ago. And then there's also, if you don't like subtitles, there's always the Swedish version starring Kenneth Branagh. And it's interesting because he did not watch any of the previously made TV versions of the series because he wanted to develop his own idea of who Kurt Wallander was. And also the Kenneth Branagh version follows the books very closely, much more so than the previous Swedish ones. And he does I think he does a good job of capturing kind of the essence of the character, which is this, really tired, worn out detective who has a difficult relationship with his daughter. He's divorced from his wife, and he's just really, the weight of the crimes that he solves, he just carries with him all the time. And yet you're always rooting for him. You just grow to love this character because as damaged as he is, he's so dedicated. He's such an interesting person. He listens to classical music. He loves opera. There's a whole another side to him that you get to experience when you read these books, which makes all the grief that he carries around with him more bearable because he's so human and we can identify with him. He's flawed, but he's interesting, and that's what makes Nordic noir, a lot of the characters in Nordic noir, so intriguing. And then just has anybody ever seen any of the Wallander series on TV? Did you see the Kenneth Branagh?
We saw both.
You saw both? So here's a little interesting side note. So in the Swedish version of the TV series, it's not really based on books, but it's based on the characters. The woman who plays his daughter, Her name was Johanna Sahlstrom. And in the book, and as well as the TV series, she follows in her father's footsteps and becomes a police officer. And she's an intriguing character in and of herself. And Henning Mankell actually started a new series based on the daughter. And the first book, and the first and only book in that series is called Before the Frost, where Linda Wallander, his daughter, is the main character, and Kurt Wallander just kind of appears once in a while. However, he never wrote any more, and originally he was set out to do a trilogy of the Linda Wallander stories, but he stopped because right around he wrote that one, I don't remember what year it was, but it was a long time passed between when he wrote the first one and then the Swedish series was being made, and the young woman who played the Linda Wallander, Johanna Sahlstrom, who at the time was a single mother of a young child, committed suicide. And she had, a few years before that, she had survived the tsunami in Thailand, and she had her 3-year-old daughter in her arm and was holding onto a tree for dear life. And she managed to survive that horrific ordeal. But then a few years later, the weight of it, and she really struggled with depression her whole life, the weight of that was too much, and she ended up killing herself while they were making the Wallander series, and he was writing these books. And Henning Mankell was so deeply upset and affected by her death and the grief of it that he could not bring himself to write any more of those books. So that's why there's only one Linda Wallander book in the series. And I have a little clip here. I just love him. He's a really interesting man. He's had such an interesting career and life. And I have a little clip here. Oh, wait, hold on. I will get it for you. Where he's being interviewed to say what some of his favorite things are. And it's called The Quickfire. Hold on one second. And I'm sorry, there may be commercials because that's what YouTube is.
My favorite fictional detective is Sherlock Holmes. The scariest place I ever visited was a place with a lot of mutilated bodies.
Can you hear it
after
all?
the Civil War in Africa. My favorite
Oh, sorry. I had to exit out. Okay.
film is Mississippi Burning.
So he just said his favorite film is Mississippi Burning.
It's a film that very clearly talks about
Can we adjust the volume, Andrew?
huge racist problem in the United States. My final meal, if I want one, would be cod and potatoes and vegetables. My favorite book cover is Robinson Crusoe finding the footprint in the sand. I write everywhere where I happen to be. My favorite crime writer is Conan Doyle. My alcoholic drink of choice is Chianti Classico red wine. My favorite to take for a date would today be Kristen Scott Thomas, because she seems to be so intelligent and so emotional at the same time, which makes her very interesting to talk with.
So, now we're really loud. So I just love that little interview.
Now
'Cause-
Michael's for 50% off Valentine's Day
sorry.
before party and walk.
Okay, I just love that little brief interview with him, because when he starts off by saying his favorite author is Sir Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes is his favorite detective, that I just love that. And I also love, he's so disheveled that to me, that's probably what Kurt Wallander would have looked like, you know. He just is that character in so many ways. But another really interesting thing about, let me go back to my slideshow here. Kurt Wallander, I'm sorry, not Kurt Wallander, Henning Mankell became very ill with cancer in the mid-2010s, like around 2012 or so. And he didn't know what was going to be the outcome of his illness. But while he was ill and going through treatment, he wrote a beautiful book of a collection of essays called Quicksand, What It Means to Be a Human Being. And, you know, there's just so many beautiful essays in here about his life, his experiences, comments about society, about the environment, and none of it is morose and like, oh, you know, I'm dying and, you know, life is terrible and I went through this. It's just these really moving essays about what it means to be a human being and live in the world today. I read this several years ago. I highly recommend it to anyone. It's an uplifting read. It's not a depressing read like some of his other books. And it's just some beautiful things. And one of my favorite quotes that he has in the book is, not having time for a person, not being able to sit in silence together with somebody, that's the same as rejecting them, as being scornful about them. And I just find that really moving, and it's so true. We often feel like we have to fill the silence with chitter chatter. And really, you're showing more by being able to be with someone in silence. Maybe not on the first date, but you know, in general, I think I love that quote. So anyway, he wrote this, and then unfortunately he did succumb to cancer, and he died in around, I think it was 2015. So it was a huge loss to literature and just mankind in general. And I have another, oh gosh, here we go. No, we already did this one, sorry. I wanted to show you a quick clip of the Wallander series. Now, I'm just gonna warn you, some of these clips might have a little bit of gore and a little bit of graphic, you know, visuals. But it's very brief because this is just a trailer. This is the Swedish version. Oh God, I did it again. I'm so sorry. Okay, I will end this. End slideshow. And now, can you see it? Yes. Okay, so this is just a trailer for the Wallander series that's in Swedish. And I think the best version, that's his daughter. So it's very gripping and great characters. And then let's go back to where am I? Oh God, sorry. I think I've got something playing in the background. Okay. And now I just want to go over those, merge into the British authors. So we've got our melancholy Nordic and British detectives here. We've talked about Kurt Wallander, Harry Hule, Martin Beck, Erlander Svensson, and now we're bridging into how some of these contemporary British mystery writers and series are also sharing some of that style of the Nordic noir. So we've got the Shetland series by Anne Cleves, with the main protagonist, Detective Jimmy Perez. Vera Stanhope, you know, is kind of in that realm. She's a cantankerous, wonderful character based in Northern England. Jimmy Perez, Shetland Islands, of course, is on the Shetland Islands outside of Scotland. And then the Inspector Morse, he's just the typical curmudgeon, you know, chip on his shoulder kind of detective. But they're all set in Oxford and not out, you know, in the country usually. And then we have, of course, Adam Dalgliesh, who is the P.D. James protagonist in many of her series, and he is a gentleman who happens to be a police officer, but he also is kind of brooding. The TV series, I think, is not very good. It's not, I don't feel like it really reaches the characters in the original books, but it is still, it's fun to watch. I really love P.D. James. She's like the quintessential British mystery writer for me. So I highly recommend her series. So here's P.D. James. It's interesting about her that she did not start, she didn't start writing until she was almost 40 years old. She was a civil servant. She worked in hospital administration and was married with 2 daughters. And her husband came back from World War II, a very damaged man. He had schizophrenia, was very sick, and was in and out of institutions for most of their marriage. And then when he died in the mid-60s, she kept working as a civil servant, and when she retired at the age of 59, she started writing full-time. But she'd already published many books, starting with Cover Her Face with the Adam Dalgliesh mystery series. So she's a really interesting woman. She dropped out of school when she was 16, and yet with the way she writes, she sounds like she could have a PhD. You know, she's just really an intelligent writer. And I really, I think I read somewhere that, you know, people wondered if she was just a little bit in love with her main character, Adam Dalgliesh. And then she also wrote another very short series. Didn't last long, but it was called Cordelia Gray. She was a private detective, but they turned the first 2 books in the series into TV shows, and P.D. James was so unhappy with the results of those TV shows that she said, "I'm not writing any more Cordelia Gray," because they're just not representing the character as I see it. And then Cullen Dexter wrote The Inspector Morse. The books are great, but the series is just a real jewel. And John Thaw's The Quintessential Morse. And if you are familiar with it, then you'll know that you don't learn his first name until, in the books, you don't learn it until the second to last book in the series. He hates his name for whatever reason. You know it starts with an E, but that's all you know. And then towards the end of his life, you discover his name is Endeavor. He's named, I forget what he's named after, it's like a ship or something. And then at the end of the series, I believe is actually the end of Morse's life. So you kind of see his mature career through to the end. But in the last 5 years, I guess, they started the new series on PBS called Endeavor, and it's supposed to be about his early days with the police force when he was a sergeant. And he was a student at Oxford. He was a working class guy. His dad was like a cab driver, I think. And he was a working class guy who got a scholarship to Oxford, but he failed out because his grades weren't up to snuff. But he presents himself as a very well-educated man. He loves opera, especially Wagner, and he does really difficult crossword puzzles. So again, another really intelligent detective who's very layered and has lots of parts to his personality, but a loner, and does not always fit in with, you know, groups of people and, you know, the general population. And he's sometimes just so rude to his Sergeant Lewis. And then also there was an offshoot of the Inspector Morse series, not with books, but with a TV series called Inspector Lewis. So Lewis, who was Morse's grunt man and sergeant, goes on to become an inspector himself. And that was a really good series. Very different, but based on that character. And it became a popular TV series you could watch on Channel 11 through Masterpiece Mystery, I think. So anyway, Cullen Dexter, he's kind of a classic British author. Anne Cleeves, who I mentioned, the Shetland series is really good, and it's like Nordic Noir, the setting, the landscape is almost like a character in the book, and it's so important to the story and the people in the story. She does that with the Shetland series, and to some extent with the Vera Stanhope series, which takes place in Northumberland, I believe. And interestingly, I don't know if she stopped writing for the Shetland series. I think it's been a while since she published one for that series. But the series on TV through streaming devices, the main character who played Jimmy Perez, I forget his name, he dropped out of the show. So they introduced a whole new detective, a woman who also has ties to Shetland the way Jimmy Perez did, and is coming back regretfully to, somebody died, I don't know. And so even though the books may have stopped, the popularity of the characters and the stories and just that original idea is still carried on through film in various forms, and you may or may not think it's doing it justice, but they're still very entertaining. The Shetland series is really good, and just the landscape is amazing, and the sweaters. And Vera Stanhope, she's kind of reminds me of Columbo. She's kind of this, she just is really disheveled. She throws her clothes on. She's kind of this frumpy middle-aged woman, and she calls everyone pet. She's a loner. She's never been married, no kids, and she can be really harsh with her staff, but she's very devoted to them and loyal to them. And she's quick, really smart, and sees things that other people on her team don't see. And she's just very engaging and fun to watch. And then some other British mysteries that I really love that aren't necessarily Nordic noir, but I think are worth mentioning because they're I have found them very good series, is Ellie Griffiths. She has the Ruth Galloway series. Has anyone ever heard of it? And Ruth Galloway is actually an archaeologist who is somewhere in northern England, and she finds some old bones when she's digging, and it's tied to an actual murder case, and so she starts developing a relationship with the police force nearby. So it covers both her archaeological experiences and doing digs and history and all that stuff, because she's also a professor at a local university. And then it also goes into her complex relationship with the inspector who works with her on some of these cases. Great character development. It verges sometimes a little bit on the cozy side, but there's still some grit to it, and they're very engaging. Ruth Rendell, like P.D. James, she is really an integral part of British mysteries. She also wrote under the name Barbara Vine. She did a lot of psychological thrillers, but she does have a series featuring Inspector Wexford, who's a very typical middle-class British police officer, but still fun to read. Elizabeth George, she's an American who's writing British mysteries. Some of you, if you're a purist, might have a problem with that, but it's a very popular series until she killed off a main character, and then everybody got pissed off. So, but they also made that into a TV series, not so successfully in my opinion, but it's still an engaging read. And then Peter Robinson, he's not Scottish, sorry. Peter Robinson wrote the Inspector Banks series, which was also on TV. And he's a British detective who's, always lonely and, has these hit or miss relationships and solving crime. I don't remember, I think it's in London. Deborah Crombie is another American who is writing British mysteries. Duncan Kincaid and Gemma James they start off as working together, and then they get married, and they're still working together solving crimes, which doesn't seem quite ethical to me, but it's all fiction. So, but she lives in Texas and writes these stories that are based in England, somewhere in England, probably London. And then there's Ian Rankin, who is a Scottish writer, and he developed the Inspector John Rebus series. So there's some heavy Scottish accents in there, which can be very hard to understand, but they're fun. And most of those stories take place in Edinburgh. And there are so there's all the books that he's written, and then there's another series that's also based on that character. And then I just wanted to mention, because although I am talking a lot about the print versions of these Nordic noir and British mysteries. There's a lot of them have been turned into TV. But there's also some really great TV shows that are based on that tradition or that style of Nordic noir that are not based on books, that are really worth checking out if you don't mind subtitles. So we've got the Bridge, which there are 3 versions of this story. The original was a Swedish Denmark thing where it involves a dead body that is found on a bridge between Sweden and Denmark, right? And so detectives from both countries have to work together to solve it. It's very good, but it is not for the weak of heart because horrible things happen. But it's really well acted, great, worth binging if you can stomach it. I mean, it's not like really gratuitously gross. It's just like a really horrible death happens and it pissed me off so much, but it was still a good show. But then they did another version that was French and British, which was pretty good, but always I prefer the original one in the language that it was originally written in. But it was a good show. And then they did an American version, which I didn't even bother seeing because it takes place between Texas and Mexico or something, and something like that. But anyway. But we have, you can stream some of these things, or you can check them out. We have some of them in DVD form here at the library. And then The Killing. Okay, I have to tell you about this. I know we're going into our hour, but this was a groundbreaking TV series that came out in the 2000s. And let me just show you. How did I do it? Here it is. So it is I believe it's Danish. It came out in the 2000s. Its original title is like Forbrydelsen or something, which translates to the crime. But the English version is always, or the English name is always The Killing. And this was very groundbreaking because it was a female detective who had a really hard time connecting with people, but doggedly solved this crime. It went in all these different directions. There were lots of twists, and it really took the people by storm. It was so unique and new for this genre in TV film. So it was very, very popular, and then it moved over into other countries and became a very highly popular watched series, but it was really hard to find. So I actually had to buy it from Amazon. But you can stream it, the original version in Danish, through Hoopla, through the library's website with your library card. I highly recommend it. Then they did an American version, which actually was pretty good, I thought. It takes place in Seattle, and it's the same idea. This crime is very similar, it's in English, and it's with a different actors, obviously, playing the characters. But in both of them, what's really interesting, I'm a knitter, and a big part of the chatter online was the sweaters that the main characters wore. And like you can see in the packaging, they played up on the whole sweater thing that was going on in that series. It's a very small little side thing, but people were trying to figure out how to design those sweaters and make them. It was all over the internet. It was kind of fun. So I highly recommend both versions of The Killing. And then there's just a whole bunch of others. Border Town was a great series on Netflix. These are really complex detectives and characters that are just really engaging. And then there's a lot of British ones too. Broadchurch is great. Prime Suspect is kind of older, but you can't go wrong with Prime Suspect and Helen Mirren. Endeavor I mentioned. River is only one season, but it's highly worth it. The main character is this bedraggled detective. And the guy who plays him is actually a Swedish actor, but it all takes place in England. Anyway, I highly recommend River. It was very good. And a big, big plot twist that you don't see coming right away. Marcella is another 3-season one. It kind of got weird in the 3rd season, but it's still kind of fun to watch. Hinterland is interesting. It takes place in Wales, and there's 2 versions. One is in Welsh, and then another in English. And it was very good. Unforgotten is on PBS. Inspector Lewis, as I mentioned, in a really great series, but also kind of dark, and the detective can be pretty unethical sometimes. It's called Luther. It's pretty good, yeah. And that's how I discovered, what's his name, Idris Ilben or something? And oh, he's fun to watch. Anyway, so very quickly, that is some of the digital or film versions of some of these great mysteries that are out there. There's lots of different streaming platforms. MHZ Choice is only international films. You do have to pay a monthly subscription or an annual subscription, but you can get films from all over the world, and TV series. And then BritBox is one of my favorites, and Acorn TV is also really good. Hulu is showing more and more international stuff. You can try using Hoopla through your local library. Netflix has got more and more international stuff. A lot of Scandinavian noirs on Netflix now, which is great. But again, these things come and go, so they're only on there for a limited time and then they change. PBS Passport, if you miss them on when they originally run, you can watch them through PBS. It's with a subscription, and then HBO Max and Prime Video are getting more and more Scandinavian and foreign language shows, and they're totally worth it. I mean, there's nothing like reading a good book, but it's a lot of fun to watch Nordic noir. It's a good experience, and hopefully you can try some of these and have as much fun doing it as I have. Thank you. And sorry about all of the technical difficulties.